You know, there's a law out there working pretty much in the shadows that has a huge impact on the private messages of millions of Americans. And believe it or not, its future is being decided right now. So in this explainer, we're going to break down what this law is, how it works, and why it's become such a massive deal in Washington.
It's a question we've all wondered about, right? When you shoot an email to a friend overseas or DM someone on social media, who else is looking? You might be surprised to find out the answer is, well, it's complicated.
And that really gets us to the heart of it. One of the most powerful surveillance laws the U.S. has ever had is about to just expire. And that's forcing a huge showdown in Congress over this constant tug-of-war between our privacy and national security. So what are we actually talking about here? The law is called Section 702. It's part of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA for short. And you got to understand, this is one of the most powerful and, one of the most controversial tools the government has in its entire arsenal.
Okay, so on one hand, intelligence agencies will tell you this law is absolutely critical. They say it's how they track foreign terrorists and stop attacks. But on the other hand, you have groups like the ACLU who say, hang on, this law lets the government scoop up international communications on an enormous scale, all without a warrant, even when it's Americans who are on the other end of the line.
And we're not just talking about emails here. This thing covers pretty much the entire spectrum of our digital lives. Your phone calls, your texts, your private messages on social media, your emails, and even just what you're browsing on the web. It's like a giant, invisible digital net.
So the big question is, how do they actually do it? How does the government get its hands on all this data? Well, it really boils down to two major programs. So first up is a program called PRISM. This is where the NSA goes straight to the tech giants, think Google, Apple, Facebook, and basically orders them to hand over data on certain users. But then you've got Upstream, and this one is way, way broader. With Upstream, the NSA literally taps into the backbone of the internet itself, those huge fiber optic cables carrying our data around the world, and just copies massive streams of traffic as it flows by.
And this is where things get really sticky. The law technically says the government can only target foreigners who are outside the US. But think about it. If they're targeting someone in, say, Germany, they inevitably sweep up all their conversations with people here in the States. The ACLU puts it this way. Vast quantities of our communications are still searched and amassed, even when we're not the ones being targeted.
And this surveillance net, it's not just sitting still. It's been growing. A lot. The number of people being targeted under this law has shot up over the years.
Let's just look at the raw numbers for a second. Back in 2013, right after Edward Snowden blew the whistle on all this, the government said it was targeting just under 90,000 people.
Okay, now let's fast forward to 2021. That number, it has ballooned to over 232,000 targets.
I mean, just look at that jump. The number of targets basically tripled in under a decade. And it's so important to remember, every single one of those targets could mean that the private communications of hundreds, maybe even thousands of other people, including lots of Americans, are getting swept up in the process. But here's the catch, and for privacy advocates, this is the whole ballgame. We know how many foreigners are targeted, but the government has never, ever told us the number that really matters for this whole debate. How many Americans have had their private communications collected and stored in a database? The ACLU says this is a massive transparency problem.
So what happens to all this data on Americans? Well, it leads to something that critics have nicknamed the backdoor search loophole. It's basically how a tool that's supposed to be for foreign spying gets turned around and used for domestic surveillance. It's really a pretty simple three-step process. First, the NSA collects all that data while looking for foreign intelligence, and in doing so, it sweeps up tons of Americans' communications. Second, all that data gets dumped into these huge government databases. And then, and this is the key part, the FBI can go into those databases and search for an American's name or email address, all without ever having to get a warrant from a judge. This, critics argue, is basically a free pass for the FBI. It's a way for them to get around the Constitution and read our private messages that are already in the government's hands without needing to justify it to a court first.
And according to government reports that have been declassified, this free pass has been abused. We're talking about agents allegedly using these searches for things that have absolutely nothing to do with national security, like looking up their relatives, digging up dirt on journalists, and even searching for information on a U.S. congressman.
So you're probably thinking, wait a minute, where are the courts in all this? Isn't it their job to put a stop to this stuff? Well, you'd think so, but it's just not that simple.
At the very center of this whole thing is the Fourth Amendment. You know, the one that protects us all from unreasonable searches and seizures. It's the reason the police normally need to get a warrant before they can look through your stuff.
But here's the problem. Every time a group has tried to challenge Section 702 in court, the case gets thrown out. And the reason is almost always the same. The government argues the whole program is a state secret, and they can't risk talking about it in an open courtroom. So the core constitutional question never really gets answered.
So if the courts are on the sidelines, who does that leave? Yep, Congress. Since the law is up for renewal, the decision lands squarely in their lap. They're facing a massive choice about what privacy is going to look like for all of us.
And privacy advocates are pushing hard for some major changes. The #1 thing on their list? Making the FBI get a warrant before doing those backdoor searches for Americans' information. But they also want to narrow down who can be targeted in the first place, put limits on how long our data is kept, and, just create a lot more transparency so we can all see how big this program really is.
So, at the end of the day, as this whole debate rages on, it really forces us to ask a pretty fundamental question. In an age where so much of our lives are online, where our data is zipping across borders every second, what does the right to privacy even mean anymore? That's really the question at the very heart of the fight over Section 702.